समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
India now faces what can be best described as the Trump pill, a bracing dose of transactional geopolitics and neo-mercantilist tariffs that upend the diplomatic comfort of the past decade. With sweeping 25% tariffs targeting Indian exports, our long-standing belief in strategic autonomy and global goodwill is being challenged by the brutal arithmetic of trade imbalances and national interests. Now, this isn't just a policy shift. It's a call to recalibrate how India positions itself economically and diplomatically in a world now shaped by profit-first diplomacy. So the newly announced tariffs from the Trump administration pose a direct threat to India's export competitiveness. Sectors such as electronics, smartphones, automobile parts, and gemstones will be hit hardest. Comparatively, say a country like Vietnam faces only 20% tariffs, and economies like Indonesia or Bangladesh enjoy relatively lighter penalties. Now, when it comes to India, while pharmaceutical products, semiconductors, and critical rare earths remain exempt for now, there is a growing uncertainty about India's continued access to these carve-outs, particularly as Trump intensifies his focus on bilateral trade wins. Further compounding this threat is the ambiguity around secondary sanctions tied to India's oil imports from Russia. A punitive surcharge, which is being conveyed again and again by Trump but not yet formalized, could be crippling. Now, as we shall see, this issue is not merely economic. It strikes at the very heart of India's strategic alignment or multi-alignment. So, the stakes for India are high. Without a trade deal with the United States, economic ramifications could be severe. Now, what those ramifications could be? For instance, capital flows may dry up, leading to a weakening rupee. Stock markets are already reflecting investor nervousness, and early estimates suggest India's GDP could suffer a 0.2 to 0.5% contraction. Now, unlike Brazil, with whom US enjoys a trade surplus, or China, which retains leverage through its monopoly over rare earth minerals, India finds itself in a vulnerable middle. Now, it's true that India has little immediate leverage in trade. Brazil, for example, enjoys strategic indulgence from Washington thanks to its trade surplus. China, with its iron grip over rare earth supplies, forced the US to capitulate during past confrontations. Meanwhile, Trump has also succeeded in strong-arming traditional allies. Now, he recently finalized a trade agreement with the European Union after imposing 25% tariffs on select sectors and billions of dollars promised in investment. He's also coaxed Japan into signing a deal with 15% tariffs and a $550 billion in investments. Likewise, he has also finalized a deal with Indonesia and Vietnam, South Korea, both with lesser tariffs than India's. With India, however, talks have hit roadblocks, both economic and geopolitical. Now, US objections to India's protectionism in agriculture and dairy, they've been long-standing. But the deeper threat comes from Washington's insistence on penalizing Indian oil imports from Russia. Trump's support for the Blumenthal-Graham bill, threatening secondary sanctions on nations buying discounted Russian crude, marks a shift. Now, initially dismissed due to Trump's own ambivalence towards Ukraine and open admiration for Putin, this bill has re-emerged as Trump has pivoted back towards Europe, leaving India rather exposed. So let's understand better how this shift has happened. India's rise on the global stage in the past decade owed much to its favorable geopolitical moment. As the Indo-Pacific became the center of global strategic focus, India was cast as a vital counterweight to China. Western powers embraced New Delhi's role, drawn by its demographic strength, the huge market, and democratic credentials. Narendra Modi's assertive leadership added to this perception, projecting a self-assured India that could balance friendships and strategic autonomy. Now, this moment reached its zenith during the Ukraine war. India walked a fine line, maintaining strategic ties with Russia by buying discounted crude while presenting itself as indispensable to the West. With Europe quietly benefiting from Indian refined Russian oil, India asserted its strategic autonomy with confidence. Critics were dismissed, and domestic media celebrated the country's ability to chart its own course. And yet, the foundations of this narrative were always shaky. India's much-vaunted Make in India and PLI schemes failed to attract the level of foreign investment once expected. American Apple and Swedish Saab were exceptions, not the rule. Despite diplomatic fanfare, manufacturing remained sluggish. India continued to import heavily from China to sustain its exports to the West, undermining the very essence of supply chain resilience it hoped to project. Now, what has happened is that the US rope has slackened. India's comfort with the US came in part from the Biden administration's strategic long rope, granting India considerable leeway on Russia due to the overarching goal of countering China in the Indo-Pacific. Now, many in India, if you remember, critical of Biden administration's occasional rebukes on human rights and democracy, waited for Donald Trump's return, expecting better and smoother alignment. After all, the Modi-Trump camaraderie, at least the projected camaraderie, ideological proximity between the BJP and the American right, and figures such as J.D. Vance and his Indian connection, and Tulsi Gabbard and her Hindu connection seemed to promise continuity. Now, at first, these hopes appeared justified. Trump's flirtations with Russia and disdain for Ukraine were read as validation of India's balancing act. His praise for Putin and indifference to Europe's pleas bolstered India's confidence that ties with Russia would remain rather acceptable to Washington. But then the tide turned. Trump pivoted towards Europe, resumed arms shipment to Ukraine, and kind of repositioned himself as the West's unlikely savior. Now, India, once seen as a partner, became a laggard in aligning with Trump's new vision. But all said and done, the most jarring was Trump's dismissal towards Indian strategic concerns, his tone-deaf response to India's Operation Sindoor and flirtations with Pakistan, offering Islamabad a trade deal while brushing off India's, all this kind of sent an uncomfortable message. For Trump, no friendship is immune to the lure of leverage. That he ignored India's history with cross-border terrorism and rehyphenated India-Pakistan under the guise of repeated claims to mediation was a rude awakening in New Delhi. Meanwhile, Trump managed to secure trade deals with nearly every major and relevant global economy: Europe, Japan, the UK, Mexico, Canada, Indonesia, South Korea, Vietnam. With all these countries now, the US has a deal. India, once seen as central to America's Indo-Pacific strategy, now finds itself isolated, at least for now. So how do we find the quid pro quo? And what it requires is favoring realism over rhetoric. The anger in New Delhi is understandable, but the time for rhetorical posturing is over. India must now seek a clear-eyed quid pro quo. First, India must shed a self-referential sentimentality and recognize that it lacks the immediate leverage others enjoy. China remains an unreliable neighbor to us, exploitative and opportunistic. Tactical rapprochement that is happening right now cannot substitute for structural mistrust and foundational problems. India's opening to China must be measured, lest it be exploited again to Beijing's advantage. Second, we must accept hard truths about our own vulnerabilities and inefficiencies. Agriculture and dairy sectors are resistant to reform not because of US deep state, but because successive Indian governments have failed to modernize them. Red tapeism and a weak investment climate have always deterred foreign capital more than any other external factor or the deep state theory. Third, India must reassess the costs and benefits of its Russian oil strategy. While it does fetch about $40–50 billion dollars of revenue, and this revenue is generated from refining and reselling crude oil, and this also remains tempting, the potential long-term costs in the form of investor flights and punitive tariffs could outweigh short-term gains. Now, that said, optics do mean a lot, even if not all, in diplomacy. And a decision on Russian crude must be made with caution, not knee-jerk sentimentality. So what is required is resilience, not retaliation. India's future lies in pragmatism. Protectionism must be phased out gradually, not in disruptive shocks. Strategic autonomy must not mean rigidity. It must evolve into an agile, resilient policy that adapts to changing global currents. Now, we must also discard the notion that foreign policy is fueled by sentiment, by friendships, or nostalgia. Professional diplomacy demands clear cost-benefit analysis and the ability to compartmentalize accordingly. Now, Trump's transactionalism may appear vulgar to us, but it also forces us to shed illusions about ourselves. India cannot continue conflating status with power. But India has to create incentives and resilience, accepting that just like us, others work in their national interests too. To preserve our economic aspirations, India must remain at the negotiation table with the US. Services remain our strength, even though they are not part of the current trade deal, and any deal should be designed to arrive at a point where this advantage could be leveraged. This may require short-term compromises, and all these actors with whom US has already had a trade deal have made compromises. But these short-term compromises could prevent long-term economic marginalization. India must tread cautiously, alienating the world's largest economy now, just as global supply chains reconfigure and capital seeks new destinations, could undo years of economic progress and the risk of falling into the web of Beijing's desires, succumbing to junior partner status in Southern Asia. The objective, therefore, is not to placate Trump. The objective is to do the best it takes for India's national interest. So the real challenge is not to resist every external pressure, but to align our domestic reforms with the demands of a changing world. In doing so, India can uphold its sovereignty, protect its interests, and continue to rise, not as a victim of global shifts, but as a deft navigator of them. I'll be back to discuss this and more. Stay tuned.